Every community, whether it's a family, a workplace, or a church, eventually has to ask itself a really tough question. What do we do when one person's actions start to threaten the health of the whole group? Well, today we're diving into a raw and pretty intense answer to that question found in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We're going to walk through it verse by verse and see exactly how this ancient letter deals with a full-blown community crisis.
And we've got a clear roadmap for this journey. We'll break it down into 4 main parts. First up, we'll get a shocking report that kicks the whole thing off. Then, we'll see Paul deliver the spiritual verdict from a distance. After that, we'll explore the idea of one bad ingredient to really understand why this was so dangerous. And finally, we'll get some major clarification on judging inside, not outside. All right, let's jump in.
So, Act 1, a shocking report. This whole story starts not with some quiet rumor, but with a public scandal that's made its way all the way to the Apostle Paul, and he has no choice but to step in and confront it head-on.
We kick things off with verse 1. And wow, Paul does not mince words. He says it is actually reported, which means, hey, this isn't a secret, the word is out, there's a type of immorality happening among you that's so out there, even the surrounding non-Christian culture would be shocked. To really picture this, imagine a town prior standing in the middle of a public square, unrolling a scroll and just shouting this news out for everyone to hear. This is a public disgrace.
Okay, now for verse 2. And this is where things get really weird. Instead of being horrified and grieving over this, Paul says the community is puffed up. They're arrogant about it. Maybe they were twisting the idea of freedom in Christ into a license to do anything. The best way to visualize this is to picture a huge party. People are laughing, celebrating, having a great time, but over in the corner, a fire is started and it's slowly spreading. And nobody seems to care. They're celebrating while a huge danger is growing right there among them. All right, that brings us to Act 2. Paul might be hundreds of miles away, but he is absolutely not going to let this situation just slide. He steps in with a clear, decisive, and authoritative judgment.
In verse 3, Paul makes it clear that distance is no barrier here. He says, I may be absent in body, but I am present in spirit, and I have already judged this. To get this in your head, picture a hologram of Paul suddenly flickering into existence in the middle of their gathering. He's not physically there, but he's pointing with this totally decisive look on his face. His judgment has arrived.
Verse 4 is so important because it shows this isn't just Paul's personal opinion. He's not just freelancing here. He tells them to gather together in the name and power of Jesus Christ. The image for this is a judge's gavel, but as it comes down to strike the block, it starts to glow with this divine light. This isn't a human ruling. This is a verdict backed by spiritual authority.
And verse 5, this is the sentence, and it sounds incredibly harsh. Deliver such a one to Satan. Whoa. What this means is to remove him from the spiritual protection and community of the church. But look at the goal. It's not to condemn him forever, but so that his spirit might ultimately be saved. The picture here is someone being firmly but deliberately escorted out of a warm, brightly lit home and pushed out into a dark, raging storm. The shock of being in that wilderness is meant to wake him up, to make him realize what he's lost, and hopefully turn back.
So, why? Why such a drastic step? Well, in our third act, Paul uses this really powerful, everyday metaphor to explain the danger of just letting this go. It's all about how one single bad ingredient can spoil the whole batch.
Verse 6 gets right to the point. Paul calls them out on their pride and then asks this crucial question. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Leaven is just yeast. To see this principle in action, imagine a perfectly clear, tall glass of water. Now, just watch as a single drop of black ink is released into it. At first, it's just a small cloud, but in moments, that one tiny drop has turned the entire glass of water murky and gray. That's the danger they were ignoring.
So what's the solution? Verse 7 says, purge out the old leaven. He connects this directly to the Jewish festival of Passover, where every single family would go through their house and meticulously clean out any and every trace of yeast. The action here is someone at a counter just vigorously scrubbing a big mixing bowl, scraping out every last fleck of old sour dough so they can start completely fresh.
This slide just lays out that leaven principle perfectly. It's a simple, predictable process. Step 1, you start as a new lump, a community that's fresh and pure. But then, step 2, you allow some old leaven, a small corrupting influence, to get in and stay there. And what happens next is inevitable. Step 3, that influence spreads until the entire lump, the whole community, is affected.
And Paul wraps up the metaphor here in verse 8.
The whole point isn't just to get rid of the bad stuff, it's to celebrate with the good. He says their whole community life should be like a festival, but one celebrated with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So picture a beautiful celebratory table, but instead of fancy, puffed-up cakes, it's set with simple, pure, flat, unleavened bread, symbolizing honesty and integrity.
Okay, this brings us to our final, and maybe most crucial, act. It seems the Corinthians had completely misunderstood something Paul had told them before. So now, he has to take the time to clarify a really vital distinction. Where exactly does the community's responsibility begin, and where does it end?
So in verse 9, Paul kind of hits rewind. He says, hey, remember that other letter I sent you? I wrote to you then not to associate with immoral people. That was the original instruction. But as we're about to see, they took it in a completely wrong direction.
And here, in verse 10, is the big clarification. He says, look, I obviously wasn't talking about people outside the church. He makes this great logical point. If you were trying to avoid all immoral people in the world, you'd literally have to leave the planet. That's not the goal. The visual here is someone walking through a chaotic, bustling marketplace. They're interacting with everyone, doing business, talking, but they're not being consumed by the chaos. It's about engagement, not isolation.
Verse 11 draws the sharp, critical line in the sand. This rule, he says, applies specifically to someone inside the community. A person who calls themselves a brother or sister but is choosing to live a lifestyle defined by these destructive patterns without any desire to change. The command is serious. Don't even share a meal with such a person, because that's a sign of close fellowship and approval.
And this list here, which Paul gives in that verse, shows the kinds of behaviors that just fracture a community from the inside out. He isn't talking about one-off mistakes or struggles. He's talking about unrepentant patterns like greed, slander, idolatry, things that act just like that leaven, corrupting the integrity of the whole group.
Paul then asks this killer rhetorical question in verse 12 to really make the point stick. He's basically saying, what business do I have judging the world outside? That's not my job. But aren't you guys supposed to be responsible for what happens inside your own house? Think of a referee on a soccer field. Their job is to make calls for the players on their field during their game. They don't start shouting penalties at people playing frisbee in the park next door.
And finally, verse 13 gives us the bottom line. The community's jurisdiction is internal. God is the judge of those outside. And because of that, Paul repeats the command with absolute force. Put away from yourselves the evil person. The image here is a gatekeeper on a high city wall, firmly pushing a heavy city gate closed to protect the people inside from a clear and present danger.
This slide just sums up the core argument perfectly. On the left, you have those inside. The community is absolutely responsible for judging its own members to maintain its spiritual health. And on the right, those outside. God is responsible for judging them. It is a crystal clear distinction between internal accountability and our posture towards the external world.
And so, this incredibly intense chapter leaves us with a really deep question to think about. How can any community, or any one of us for that matter, manage to be both pure and merciful? How do we uphold a standard of truth and holiness while at the same time extending grace and always aiming for restoration? It's a tough balance, but it's the vital challenge for any healthy group that truly wants to thrive.